Hey everybody, Professor Snart here. So we have just finished up the first unit in the first ever online honors class at COD. Yes, I will harp on that throughout the entire course probably. So this is unit 2, which we'll come back to, but I'm going to start us in our due dates here. So we've wrapped up really the main part of unit 1 with our Thursday due date. So the main post in the discussion board kind of a thing, doing your student homepage, all due on the Thursday. And now we have the little window, kind of some breathing room, where you can do the reply portion of the discussion board. But what many people have now found out is that if people are finishing this work by even as late as Thursday, but certainly by like a Tuesday, Wednesday, you can easily finish the reply part up by this Thursday date, or even hopefully today, which is Thursday when I'm recording this, and not having to wait and push it or leave it until that Sunday. So you do have the room, but it doesn't mean that you want to necessarily procrastinate and leave that part to the last minute either. But moving forward, just get in that habit of remembering that we have that dual due date system. And usually what happens, I think, for students as they the semester gets underway, you sort of find that rhythm and the schedule works out and you get used to when things are due and when you go to what class, and you start having a sense of maybe more regularly having a time where you can come into our class, or multiple times really it should be, and do whatever work that you want to get done. The nice thing about the online format isn't that it's less time necessarily on task, but it can be much more flexible. So we still have due dates, but if you have a gap in your schedule, it doesn't need to be the same time as anybody else necessarily, and you can come in and do part of the work for whatever unit that we're looking at. Okay, so now we turn around to Unit 2, which, unlike our introductions unit, is more of a content unit for our course. So we start our first readings and kind of thinking about short fiction, which is the first segment of our class, so short stories. Okay, so we'll always start a unit with a unit objective. Here, pretty straightforward. We have our first reading assignments. Notice that I've provided links to our e-text. Flight Patterns, a short story by the Native American author Sherman Alexie, and Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, by very famous contemporary American author Joyce Carol Oates. Both great stories. They share some similarities, but are also really, I would say, different in style. I especially like the Joyce Carol Oates one. I think I just like her as an author, just for how creepy it is. I'm not gonna lie. For the way that there's just that sort of atmosphere of, I don't know, it's really tense, I find, when I've read that story so many times, and I know everything that's going to happen, but I still sort of get to the end of it and find that I'm all sort of shoulders hunched up and my neck is all tight and I got to relax afterwards. And Alexie is a great novelist and short story author as well. He's actually a really good speaker too. Okay, so hopefully you enjoy our first readings there. Simple enough to do. There's a comprehension quiz. I'm not a super huge fan of these things, to be honest with you, but they do, and I guess what I'll say is the purpose for us is not to really quiz you on your ability to memorize a story or know certain trivial facts. And you can obviously have the book open, like digital or print, whatever, in front of you while you do the quiz, so it's not testing your ability to recall information. But I find the quizzes useful just for maybe pointing people towards certain elements of stories that are important, thematically, or they're important for understanding what's going on, or getting that larger picture, not again just for quizzing for the sake of quizzing, just on trivial details from a story. So do the quizzes. They shouldn't really take that long. Again, have the text open in a browser or whatever in front of you while you're doing them. No biggie. Okay, so that gives us our content, or our subject matter then for this unit. And then we have what you might call a handout, or digital handout here. There is a link. Let's see if I can scroll to it. There's a link here to the document. It's a Google Doc, but it's just embedded here. You can just read it. That give us some vocabulary, I guess, for talking about short stories, and it applies obviously across many different literary genres. And so I don't think any of the terminology is going to be super new to you, but it is, I think, just useful to sort of have it reintroduced to us maybe in front of us, so that when we talk about the various readings that we do in the class, we can use this terminology. So sometimes having the vocabulary makes having those discussions about work and even furthering our understanding a little bit, I don't know if it makes it easier, but it's more productive. It's more, I don't know, we get more out of it. And so again, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because it's probably terminology like character. You know, you've run into that before, I'm sure. But what you can do with the terminology then is actually, as you read, ask yourself questions about, like, what would you consider a major character? Somebody who is like responsible for action in a work. What would you consider a minor character? Often those are the ones who react to something that's happening. And again, it's not a hard and fast rule, so sometimes we'll have what we might call a major character who is really more passive and reactionary than necessarily the doer of things, but the story clearly revolves around that individual. We can sometimes even have things that play a major or minor role that aren't physical people, right? They can be sometimes even objects or you know, things that aren't just the typical character that we would think of, but they have a major impact on the story. Then they act or react or interact with the human characters in the story. We have the protagonist, right, which is sometimes you can just think of as that major character, the antagonist, the one who opposes, right, the protagonist. Keeping in mind this question here, where do our sympathies lie? Where are they supposed to lie? So that the protagonist is not necessarily the good guy and the antagonist is the bad guy. Oftentimes in the most complicated or most interesting kinds of fiction, we have a protagonist, a major main character, who is not, right, particularly likable or is complicated, has things that we like but also we don't like. Same goes for an antagonist, that's not necessarily just the bad guy. Points of view then, first, second, third. First and third being the most common. Rarely do we run into the second person, the you voice, except like in a choose your own adventure. You do this, you do that kind of a deal. First person is that I voice narrator. Third person is the he does that, she does that. And again, terms you may have run into before, this idea of omniscient. So the narrator knows everything about everybody and thus discloses it to us that way. Or limited omniscient, which is often what we get where the narrator is not a first person necessarily, it's third person, but there seems to be more knowledge that the narrator has about like the main character, and we're left sort of guessing a little bit about others. So it sees into the mind of like the main character, but not necessarily every character. And again, there's nothing to say that one of these is better or worse or anything like that, but it's useful as you read our stories to think about like what is the narrative perspective. How would it be different if it was first versus third or vice versa? So again, these are good terminology just for asking questions. The setting, again, setting is setting, right? But it's important to recognize and to think about how setting is used by authors to create that sense of mood or atmosphere, or even to help further certain themes or ideas. So it's not just setting because a story has to take place somewhere. It's setting because that contributes to the overall effect of the story. And I think in the stories that we read for this unit, setting is really important. Maybe not literally like it's in Seattle, for example, but the way that that story unfolds in different sort of places, right? Not the literal physical geographical location, but how setting as the place where the action unfolds is really important. And again, you'll see what that happens when you read the story. Conflict, man versus nature, society, culture, man versus himself. Probably you've run into these before. Usually these aren't mutually exclusive, so we don't necessarily just have one, but not the others going on. We often have a mix. Sherman Alexie's is a good example, I think, of this man versus himself. So obviously our main character is going to interact with other people, but it's largely the tension or the, I don't know, what compels us about the story is sort of his internal struggle with himself. There's this other stuff going on, particularly maybe man and society culture, but it often boils down to that internal sense of, I don't know, anxiety maybe that the main character in that story feels. I'm going to skip across here to theme. Theme again, like the idea, sort of the symbolism, imagery, all of that whole ball of wax that we can look for. Not necessarily the moral of a story. Especially in contemporary literature, we rarely find definitive morals being acted out. In fact, it's kind of like tedious, that kind of a story. Okay, so this brings us to plot, which, again, is what happens in a story. We're pretty familiar with that. But you may not have run into this Freytag's pyramid before. It's pretty simple, and it's just a theory of narrative structure or narrative development of telling a story. But we're going to use it as the basis for our discussion board assignment, so that's why I'm leaving it until last here. So it's pretty simple in its theoretical kind of layout here, right? We have what's called exposition. We just learn some stuff about who our characters are, where the thing is taking place. We're just setting the scene. The story continues with this rising action. Tension mounts a little bit. Things actually begin to happen. We don't just learn basics like setting and description. And then, according to the theory anyway, we have generally one sort of like moment of conflict, that sort of moment of tension, or when something major happens. And that's all relative to the story itself. So that doesn't mean that this is where somebody dies, or this is where some major gruesome thing occurs. If the story is one that's more subtle, then this climactic moment could just be a conversation between two people, and that's it. That's like the most sort of tense moment. And then we will have the falling action, right? And this French denouement, sounds very fancy to say, but the end, right? Okay. So in theory, it's easy to sort of see, yeah, we learn some stuff, things ramp up, we have this big sort of moment, and then whack, the story ends. Now our job, your job, is based on the stories that we read for this unit, so flight patterns and where are you going, where have you been. I want you to draw, and I think it's easier to do by hand, but you can do all fancy computer stuff if you want. So draw the pyramid for each story. But as I described here, it's clearly not, well, I don't think, is going to be this perfectly symmetrical, nice little thing. Draw it in a way that you think reflects what's actually happening in the story. So my example here is if I were to do it for flight patterns, for example, I would have to move this, the kind of climactic, the apex of the pyramid. It really happens, like, from my reading of it, at the very end of the story, and then the falling action denouement is really abrupt. So my pyramid would have this long rising action part and then sort of like a hunk right at the end with very little resolution that happens. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the story is it doesn't give us this neat, tidy ending, nor I think does the Joyce Carol Oates story. So your job is to then draw that. If you want to do it by hand, I think that's probably the easiest. Label it just with little phrases, right, that give us a sense of like what moment you're pointing to for what's happening during the rising action. So you could have a couple of labels there, the climactic moment that you think, and then whatever you think happens, the falling action. Just give us a couple of little phrases here. You don't have to rewrite the whole story. So draw this big enough where you can have some room to put all this stuff in there, and then take a picture of it and post it to our discussion board here. So you have two separate pictures for the two separate stories. And then here in a discussion board post, so it can be the same post, give us a little bit more of that explanation. So you can just keep it short and sweet for the actual drawing part, but give us some more of the description or the explanation for your choices in the post. So we'll have a visual, representation, but also kind of your text discussion. And there's also here the requirement to reply to two other posts. It's off the bottom of my screen capture here. Okay, so unlike our first unit where we had some pretty straightforward stuff to do, this one involves a little bit more. A couple of reading assignments, the quizzes, which hopefully won't take too long, but will draw your attention to a few important aspects of the story, the stories. Our little handout here, kind of refreshing our vocabulary for talking about these, providing us with this pyramid that will then feed into the discussion board assignment that we do. Okay, that was a lot of talking. If you have any questions, by all means, be in touch. Keep on top of those due dates, and I'll talk to everybody soon.